Hello, everyone, and welcome to Red Pill Nation. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm doing a little Christmas/end-of-year episode. I hope you've all had a nice holiday. This episode will be coming out, I think, a few days before New Year's. It's currently the day after Christmas, December 26th. And I'm here today just to kind of have a more casual conversation. This episode might not have the exact same tenor or vibe as some of my previous episodes because I'm here with two of my friends. This is Peter and Jack, who, if you've listened to to my channel for a long time, you actually will recognize their voices. And for the first time ever, you're getting to see Jack's face because I did a show called Going Dark, an Intellectual Dark Web podcast with them all through the latter half of 2019 and a good portion of this year as well. And that show ended in July, but we've still been hanging out since then. We're still all buds. And recently I was like, why not have a little reunion show where we could just chat kind of about what's happened this year with the culture war. There's no reason not to do that. And it turned out Jack and Peter were available after Christmas today. So we're just going to kind of talk about 2020 and the culture war like we always used to do on our old show. So if you liked that show, you'll really enjoy this because we're back together just to kind of chat some more. And if you like Red Pill Nation generally, this will be something a little bit different where, you know, these guys, they're my guests, but they're also my friends. So the conversation might have a little bit more of a casual feel to it. I will just mention really quickly that Jack is able to show his face. Unfortunately, Peter cannot. And it's for the same exact reason that I don't use my real name on this channel. It's just that Peter, although he'll be joining us auditorily in terms of his speaking voice today, he just can't show his face on camera because it could jeopardize his employment, which Jack and I also, to some extent, are taking that risk by showing our faces at all. But for Peter, I think it would be a particularly bad idea to show his face in his position. So he's not going to do that. But he is going to be speaking with Jack and I today. So yeah, if you listen to the old show, you'll really enjoy this. And if you've been listening to Red Pill Nation, I hope you'll enjoy this kind of different vibe episode today as well. But to just kind of jump into what we're going to be talking about, I wanted to just ask you guys kind of, I think, the best question to ask as we approach the end of the year. There's 5 days left in the year, including the rest of this afternoon and evening. What do you guys think? What do you think happened in 2020 in terms of the culture war? Because it felt like a big year, like a phase shift. And I wanted to ask you guys if you think this was, in fact, a turning point, as I believe it was, and as I think many people do. And if you do or don't, tell me why that is.
So, Scott, I think books have already been written on this subject, and many more are to be written. So clearly, it's a monumental year. I think in one of our last episodes, I mentioned that COVID has acted as an acceleration, a force for acceleration for many of the things that were brewing behind the scenes. I think maybe to start off, I mean, this question is really deep and can go in many directions. I think now, kind of looking back from December, we're seeing the kind of monolithic cultures, particularly in Silicon Valley and in New York City, starting to break down. There's big exoduses from those cities, and the people who who needed to be there, who needed to just say, "Oh, I need to go along with what's going on because it's right for my career," or I can make money off of it, or whatever. They're stepping back, and just the capability for remote work and just not being physically in those locations is potentially freeing a lot of people and hopefully creating a lot of dissent when before there was just conformity to the prevailing ideas in a lot of those places. So just the effect of breaking those kind of two cultural monoliths in the US, in New York and in San Francisco, is really seems to be taking shape. And we're seeing more and more people leave those areas. And I think that's almost universally going to be a good thing.
Yeah, and likewise, jumping off that point, the word that comes to mind throughout this year is dissonance. I think when you look at some of the major events that occurred just in this last year, not to mention the last 4 years in some, I have a list here just to quickly summarize. You have, CNN reporting that there's peaceful protest, but a little bit fiery, right? This has become a meme in sort of our circles, and I think
That was
generally speaking,
amazing.
right?
That was absolutely astounding.
You
If anyone hasn't seen that clip, it's Ali Velshi. I think it was MSNBC, and he says fiery protests which are peaceful but fiery.
peaceful but fiery, yeah, something like that. Almost parody level. Some of the reporting by CNN and other
absolutely. SNL could not
outlets.
possibly compete with reality at this point.
And so that's an example of what, in reality, what people are seeing on the ground is their business being burned to the ground, and then what you see is, but the majority are peaceful. Okay, great, but there needs to be proportionality in how that reporting is done, and then you have, and I think we may talk about this later, hopefully, but like the quarantine narrative and the idea that we need to be locked down and we need to respect these guidelines, but then you see people in marches and protests, and this is being supported or at least signed by, maybe it's a minority, but still a significant number of health officials saying that they support these protests and these marches. This is the right thing to do, contradicting that narrative. And then, I can go through other, and this includes Trump as well, right? Where he's saying stock market's up, everything's great, the economy's great, but you have mass unemployment, you have people losing their jobs, people on the streets. So there's this dissonance between the narrative that's being pushed and the reality from both sides. And I think it just reached a breaking point this year. And that's part of what Peter speaks to, that mass exodus from cities, not to mention other parts of the country, just having to deal with the loss of employment and dignity and just struggling day to day. So that's what I see.
Yeah, I think the people behind the woke narrative, I mean, they had their moment, right? They had their, we can do anything, right? They, like, everybody was listening to them over the summer. Everybody was listening to the woke crowd, right? We were elevating every voice that had been in that sphere, and almost universally, they've been proven to be frauds, in that we gave them the power, we gave them the opportunity. We said, we as a society have reached this moment that we want your solutions and we're willing to embrace them, and they had nothing. Or they just had ridiculous things that were never going to happen.
And we saw a rejection of those ideas. I think when you say they were exposed as frauds, the fact that what they came up with was like defund the police. I mean, things like
and
that
there was
were
no
rejected.
depth to it, right?
Yeah.
Like there was no
right.
Like,
you would probe them about what does that actually mean.
Yeah, like they didn't have any policies or no actionable plans. I'm kind of reminded of, when the Republicans came into Congress in 2017, they had everything. They had the presidency, they had the Senate, they had the House, and they're like, we're gonna repeal and replace Obamacare, and they had nothing, right? They were just like, oh, we're gonna get rid of the individual mandate, but we were just against stuff. We didn't actually have any policies to build, and they were all exposed as frauds. The Republicans back in 2017, I mean, not all of them, but like the establishment, they came into power, they had their moment, and they weren't able to capitalize on it because it turns out they were only against stuff. And we're seeing that with a lot of the woke crowd now. And I mean, I'm seeing, companies say, dropping their diversity programs or deprioritizing them, where they're just, they're like, oh, well, we want to do this over the summer. And then a few months later, there weren't actually any new or interesting ideas. And they had the diversity trainings and they're like, oh, actually, this is not actually helping anybody. And it's just so clear now to many more people that when you give these people power, when you give them the opportunity, when they have their moment, they're only against things. They don't actually want to build anything. And that, I think, is really shifting the narrative against a lot of those cultural figures that have emerged over the last decade.
Yeah, I think what you both said speaks to my view of this year as kind of being the year that institutions officially became illegitimate through and through. That the last institutions that were seen as trustworthy, to some extent, the media was still seen by some portions of the country to be trustworthy. To some extent, our legal authorities and judicial system who are supposed to uphold the rule of law. To some extent, medical institutions that are supposed to tell us in a straight way what is and is not safe during a pandemic. These institutions, which still had at least a modicum of trust among the people, leave the media out of it, let's say, because it was hanging by a thread to begin with. But the judicial system, which we trusted to enforce the law equally during the riots, and it failed to do so entirely because of an underlying political agenda or the optics of it and the pressure that DAs and judges were afraid to face if they enforced the law. Medical institutions and public health officials who told us that we can't gather in groups of 10, but we can gather in groups of 1,000 as long as there is a favored political cause behind that gathering. And that favored political cause is overtly racial, which also adds a very sort of gross aspect to it. And I think that what you both said speaks to the fact that these final institutions have fallen. Like, this was the year, as you said, Peter, where woke supremacy was able to take hold of everything for a moment. It had its moment where it was like, this world belongs to us. This is ours now. And as you said, what they came up with, it basically, it felt like they were in rhetorical mode for years and years and years. We were getting all this rhetoric from the woke people, and it was extremely convincing, actually, unfortunately, to the vast majority of the country. By rhetoric alone, they were able to take over every institution in this country in a large swath of the individual populace. And then they were put in a mode where we were like, okay, it's problem solving time. We've got a bunch of problems. How are you going to solve them? And it's the problems you've been talking about. How do you want to solve them? And they stayed in rhetorical mode, because defund the police is rhetoric. It's not a solution. It is completely incomprehensible as an idea. It immediately strikes it strikes even the most slightly reasonable and sane individual as an utterly insane idea to defund the police, and certainly to abolish the police. And I think, as you said, I love the way you phrased it, because I haven't really phrased it this way up to this point. It exposed them as frauds, as people who are completely incapable of solving the very problems that they have claimed to be so passionate about. And that exposes them as frauds, because if they were really passionate about it, they would have come up with some goddamn solutions.
Yeah. Even President Obama. Yeah. I was just going to say, even President Obama called it a fancy slogan, right? Defund the police.
Oh, yeah. Everyone can see through it.
Yeah. Peter.
I do think it's there were a lot of institutions and narratives that failed in 2020, but I'm coming out of 2020 much more optimistic than, both from a cultural war perspective, but also just from a broader social perspective and humanity thinking perspective. I'm coming out of it much more optimistic than I came in. So I think 2020 is going to be seen as a very transformational year for society, for humanity potentially as a whole. And I'm looking at the winners of 2020. I think it's very easy to get caught up in the negativity and the losers and just the all the terrible things that happened. But you look at the winners of 2020, and it's actually pretty remarkable. So I'm going to say Elon Musk, big winner. I mean, he has been kind of pro technology, kind of pro more libertarian type of values. He opposed the lockdowns on very scientific grounds. I mean, he kind of emerged as this cultural figure. I mean, he has been a cultural figure for a while, but he's kind of ran out of haters this year. Like, people hated him. People, were shorting Tesla and saying, "Oh, he's a fraud. He's he's just stealing people's money, and he's good at selling, his stock to stupid investors." But now people are buying into his sort of technology-driven future narrative, and the money's going there. And I mean, he got what, $100 billion richer this year?
At the very least, Peter, I was actually just going to say, exactly. At the very least, I think he still has haters, but they're all the people you would expect to hate him no matter what. And he's kind of shut them up by becoming the second richest man on planet Earth. I believe he is actually just below Jeff Bezos. He's gotten to the point where he's worth nearly $150 billion. And he's just below Jeff Bezos. He went from being like the 20th or 30th richest man on Earth to being the second richest man on Earth. Clearly, what he's doing is working for what he's been very good at, which is being an entrepreneur and getting very, very wealthy and powerful and influential.
But it's not just that, because Tesla, it's electric cars, it's zero, well, maybe not zero emissions, but low emissions. It's sort of our, he's kind of pushing without pushing the like eco-terrorist type of narrative. He is actually doing the hard work of how do we decarbonize our society. And he's not out there being like climate change is evil. He's actually solving the problems. He's actually solving the difficult problems.
So it's like a
how do you
win
charge
for
cars? How do you-
solving problems over catchy rhetoric and slogans would be
And
an
I think
individual
this
like
is-
Elon. Yeah.
And I think these figures, and I'm going to list two others, and you can, I would love to hear commentary on them. And I think these people who are actually problem solvers, who happen to also be some of the most, some of the richest, most successful people, I feel like they've captured the narrative in a way that I don't think we fully appreciate yet, because they're the ones actually solving problems. So I see the other two are Bill Gates. I mean, Operation Warp Speed. He's been talking about pandemics for a decade plus. Operation Warp Speed. We have in the US, we're going to have plenty of vaccines to go around by summer. The EU probably won't have vaccines, plenty of vaccines available until 2022. So it's been a giant success. Bill Gates really spearheading it, doing a just fantastic job in his sort of like post Microsoft life, and inspiring a lot of people. I mean, just really kind of taking up that leadership mantle from an FDA and a government, other government institutions that are just too slow to move, unwilling to make the big investments. And he's doing it. And it's like, I want more Bill Gates. I want more Elon Musk driving the direction of humanity. I think the third person is going to be super controversial. So I'm going to shut up in a minute and listen to your opinions on this. But I'd say Jeff Bezos, because what Amazon has done this year is a miracle. Like, they have kept supply chains going. They've hired millions of people, probably. Maybe not, but they've hired tons and tons of people. It's like lots of people lost their jobs. Where do they get jobs? They got jobs with Amazon. And it's Bill Gates keeping those supply chains, not Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos keeping those supply chains going, building this remarkable just system that has kept us going, that has kept my groceries arriving every week, that has kept, all the technology that I'm using right now that was delivered to my place. I mean, got them from wherever they were to me for relatively low cost, and was able to scale that up on very short notice. And that, I think that is a really underappreciated miracle of 2020, just how effective Amazon and the Jeff Bezos sort of ecosystem has been this year.
I think, Peter, in response to what you're saying, what I would say is, without really going into, I mean, we could do not just an entire show, but an entire series on any one of the people you just mentioned. I mean, entire books are going to be written about them for eons. I think that the pattern that I'm noticing is that it seems this year was a win. You put in the win category individuals who are ready to solve problems in the absence of institutions who are only able to offer rhetoric, or whose solutions will be entirely dictated by what is favored or unfavorable in the public square, i.e., our public health officials who were completely unable to provide us with accurate information about what is and isn't safe, because they were claiming that something which clearly was not safe, which was the Black Lives Matter riots and protests, was safe, or that it was at least important enough that it should not be disrupted. And that when we see an institution like that acting flagrantly and obviously in political interests, that to see individuals with, admittedly, individuals who sort of rise above the level of individual just by having an incredible level of assets. You mentioned, I think, like the first, second, and third richest people on planet Earth. I think it's no coincidence. But I think that we see them ready to solve problems that institutions cannot.
It's strange that, I mean, I wasn't thinking of that. I listed the number 1, 2, and 3 richest people on Earth.
I know. I don't think you were, but I think about it and I go, well, it's no coincidence.
It actually, I think, fits more broadly into the thesis that I've been developing this year, where I feel like for a while I have been, I guess, upset that, we have these like billionaire corporate technocrats that are kind of in charge of the world, and there's all kinds of problems associated with that. But I kind of feel we have the right technocrats right now. Like, I feel like the billionaires, the top 3 richest people in the world, are really doing some remarkable things that, while potentially have some negative consequences, by and large are just remarkable for for humanity as a whole. And the fact that they're doing a lot of this in the U.S., I think really sets the U.S. up, kind of as long as these individuals continue to be prominent and continue to be deferred to in a lot of spheres. I think that speaks to a potential for really positive, remarkable change. I've been kind of floating this idea around that. I think we're going to see more changes in the next 20 years than we saw in the last 20 years, from a technological, social perspective, vastly for the benefit of humanity. And I think, in a sense, we have the right technocrats now, and that has me kind of excited.
Yeah, I would say it does strike me that as I think about the three individuals you mentioned, they happen to be the richest people in the world. They happen to be very influential, particularly this year, and they've been wildly successful this year. I think about it and I go, none of the three of them, I know that particularly Gates and Bezos have some woke cred. I mean, Bezos owns the Washington Post. Gates is a little woke rhetoric here and there, which is pretty toothless at the end of the day. None of them are particularly woke. Certainly not Elon Musk, and even the other two are not particularly woke. So it seems like, I wouldn't say their heart is in the right place, but at the very least, their head is in the right place. These are guys who, they are entrepreneurs and they are driven by results. And I think that they've been getting results because these are three guys who are definitely capitalists. I mean, if you were to ask Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, are you a socialist? They would immediately say no. And I don't think that's any coincidence. Jack, I think you've been trying to jump in here. Go ahead.
No, I just want to say that I think there's a profound lack of gratitude for these individuals and others that are able to create these opportunities and this technology, all these job opportunities. Like if you go to a job search site, you're pretty much going to see Amazon jobs and other kind of lower paying jobs. Now, obviously it's unfortunate and that's what we're living in, but they at least have opportunities available. Now I have friends who hate Jeff Bezos, right? Like a lot of people on the left, progressives, because of the working conditions at Amazon. They compare it to slave labor or sweatshops, something like that. I'm not going to get particularly into that, and you can always improve the working conditions. But the fact is, he has given opportunity to people to work and created that infrastructure for us to handle a situation like this. So that's my kind of response to Bezos. But I also want to add that there's just people in general that have been helping as well. GoFundMe has become a major source of funding, not just for all the businesses that suffered losses because of COVID, because of lockdown, but also because of the riots. A lot of these people received massive amounts of money to rebuild their businesses, even if maybe they're not going to be receiving a regular source of income. That's encouraging to me. But again, when I had conversations with friends about this, they go, well, that's so sad. That's so pathetic that people have to rely on GoFundMe or other sites to get either healthcare funding as well. It's one of the major sources outside of Medicaid, Medicare, is just receiving private voluntary donations from others. I think that reflects the kind of the greatness of the human spirit and our willingness to be altruistic and give money for causes that maybe don't directly benefit us. So I'm also encouraged by that, in addition to Peter's examples.
Yeah, I think to kind of close out this point, I would just say, so we can move on to another aspect of the past year, I guess, let's put in the win column, individuals and extra institutional solutions where individuals band together, and not exactly into an institution, because a bunch of people donating to a GoFundMe, that's not really an institution, that's more of a coalition. So it's in the win column this year is individuals and coalitions, and in the loss column is institutions. Is that there's been a credibility transfer and there's been an efficiency transfer from institutions to individuals and coalitions. And I think that is something to be optimistic about. I'm actually glad we started on an optimistic note, because I want to get to a note that I think is much more, at the very least, arguable. And that's in terms of what happened with free speech this year, because as soon as we start getting optimistic, I remember that this was the year that it seemed that big tech started to do by far the most atrocious things they've done, because they engaged in election meddling. And I think that if we're going to talk about 2020 as it pertained to the culture war, we can't leave out what happened with the New York Post story, where the New York Post was completely censored by Twitter and other big tech institutions. With Kyle Rittenhouse, you are not allowed to defend Kyle Rittenhouse, despite the fact that all of the evidence suggests he is not guilty of murder and that he acted in self-defense in Kenosha, Wisconsin, when he shot and killed two rioters who had attacked him. And you can't defend him on Facebook or Twitter without having your statement deleted. And eventually you'll actually possibly have your, if you were to engage in this repeatedly, you would actually have your account deleted. These are moves that I think go beyond what we've seen in the past, and which are of a grave concern to me in the long run for the culture war. I'm very pessimistic. I mean, I'll put it this way, though. The optimistic note would be more attention has been drawn to these things. When the New York Post thing happened, we also saw kind of a groundswell of people like Glenn Greenwald and Michael Tracy on the left, as well as obviously all the voices on the right, including President Trump and other Republican members of the government, Republican members of Congress, including some very prominent ones, coming out and saying that this needs to be addressed immediately, to the point where Trump actually tried to veto the NDAA unless they removed Section 230. So we're seeing this issue blow wide open, and I don't think we can talk about 2020 in terms of wins and losses without deciding what exactly happened with big tech and free speech. So what do you guys think happened? Was it a net positive that the issue became kind of a bigger deal and that some people started to acknowledge it on both sides of the aisle? Or was it a negative in that the tech companies don't really seem, I mean, Twitter did eventually kind of respond to the criticism, but they seem to be on a path towards an unprecedented level of censorship?
Well, I'm going to jump in because I don't know if we're going to talk about the election directly, election fraud, or any of that situation, but I think it relates directly because people are saying that those who are questioning the election results are damaging our democracy, right? They're tearing up the fabric of reality, of our democracy. And you have to ask yourself, well, maybe they wouldn't have questioned these results as much as they are if you hadn't spent 4 years trying to oust this guy from office. You hadn't attempted soft cues to Russiagate and impeachment for investigating this or that. I mean, I could go on and on and on. But the most recent example was what you mentioned, which is, covering up different stories, including the Hunter Biden story. And that is a form of election meddling because they're suppressing stories. I mean, it isn't their fair legal right to do so. But if you're going to ask people to accept the results of an election, maybe you shouldn't be delegitimizing true stories.
The previous election.
Yeah, exactly. That, I mean, so if you want to talk about destroying our democracy, let's start with every institution for the last 4 years leading up to this point.
Yeah, the people destroying the democracy, they're not the people who want to get rid of the Electoral College. They're not the people who censor any political story that goes against their favorite candidate. They're not the people who want to add Puerto Rico and DC as states and eliminate the filibuster and pack the courts. And look, I'll just throw in a note that I don't believe the election fraud stories, and I don't necessarily think that you were saying that you do, Jack, but I think there's something to be said that certainly it was inevitable that people were going to question the results of the election regardless of the results. We all know that had Donald Trump won, the same exact thing would have happened with people on the left, and that certainly their grievances would be getting, I think that had Trump won, there would have been a full audit of the vote. I mean, there would have been as many attempts as possible to delegitimize his victory had he won. And that, yes, we are seeing it on the right, and I don't agree with it. I'm very much of the impression that Joe Biden did in fact win this election, and I've been under that impression since November 7th. But I think it's kind of an interesting note to hit on. But in terms of, I kind of want to hear about what is the state of free speech right now? Particularly as it pertains to big tech. Because I know that, and it's connected to the election fraud thing, because you can't even, if I were to actually say on the show that I do believe some of those claims, the video would be deleted, the video of this show. I'm not saying that. I happen not to believe that, which is lucky for me, because that means this video won't have to get deleted. But I kind of want to hear from you guys on free speech is, it's the most important thing in the culture war. It's the most important thing, arguably, in our culture, period. It's the reason that I got involved in this type of commentary, is because of my concerns over free speech. And this was a year where some big things happened in the world of free speech. And it is not just on college campuses. 2017 was the year of free speech on college campuses. this was the year of free speech on the internet. And I kind of want to know what we think the state of play is, what you guys think the state of play is, because again, my sort of jumping off point for you guys is, on one hand, people came together around the fact that this is a problem, but it may be too late because of the sheer ferocity of the power grabs by the tech institutions. What's going on with Kyle Rittenhouse concerns me greatly. The fact that this 17-year-old child, you can't even defend him. And by the way, his GoFundMe was deleted, and they had to raise funds for his defense on like a Christian website that is much smaller, and got him a much smaller yield, albeit still a very large one, just simply because of the level of support that exists for him. So, I mean, what are we looking at when that's the case? The Kyle Rittenhouse thing is just nuts. I mean, actually more so than the New York Post thing, in my opinion.
I think this brings up a much broader issue that I think we're still grappling with as a society. I think I'm generally going to be much more forgiving of what happens in 2020 from a censorship or otherwise perspective, because it is wartime in a sense, right? We are in many ways fighting a war. I think that's potentially the closest analogy that we can that we have from any sort of recent history. So I think I'm reading less into the specifics of what happened this year, but I think you're right. There are some very troubling things that happened, and potentially, say, using the fact that we are in this warlike situation might not be sufficient justification for those actions. So the question for me is, what is the relationship between big tech, I guess, public governments and private citizens? These are brand new types of institutions that haven't existed before. They exist globally. They exist digitally. They have unprecedented access to both public life and private life. And I think we don't have a great set of tools for how to deal with these big tech platforms. Do we treat them as private corporations? If they're private corporations, they can do whatever they want, right? If they're private corporations, they don't have to publish anything that they don't like. They can, tell other private institutions or private corporations not to. It's like, you don't have a right to a GoFundMe. I don't see that in the Bill of Rights. You don't have a right to post stuff on Facebook. Like, that's not in the Bill of Rights. So, the question is just, how does freedom of speech integrate with these platforms? Because the platforms are global. The platforms exist in countries that don't have the same set of laws. You could violate laws in other countries. And is Facebook liable for that if somebody shares your video that violates a law in another country? And I think they're trying to navigate that. And I think we as private citizens are also trying to navigate that, on top of the privacy issues, on top of the national security issues, where, if these can be used as essentially an apparatus to integrated with the NSA, how does that relationship work? And I think a lot of these decisions are now being made in secret, and potentially for good reason. I mean, I'm not aware of potentially all of the national security threats that are out there. Like, what's going on in Nashville right now? This is December 26th. Random RV exploded. We have no information. I mean, it almost sounds like there's some media suppression going on here, because
we do have very little info. It's very weird.
It's a very, very strange situation. And I mean, clearly the FBI is involved, probably the NSA is involved. A lot of communications infrastructure is down in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama. So something strange is going on, and potentially these types of threats, so we don't even know what this threat is. We have very little information about it, but it seems to be a relatively big deal given how there's curfews. Like, people have to be home 4:30 p.m. right now until Sunday. And like, that's strange. There's something really strange going on, and we don't know about it. So the question is, how common are these types of threats? Like, is this some anarchist Antifa type organization? It doesn't feel like a right-wing terrorist group from my perspective, but who knows? That they are also potentially a large threat in the country. Particularly if you're down in Tennessee, I'd expect you're probably home to more right-wing militias than anarchist Antifa types. but we don't know. And so I think we're facing unprecedented threats as a society. Look at the SolarWinds hack. Some potentially foreign, potentially domestic, potentially who knows what entity hacked like everything. They hacked the Treasury, they hacked Microsoft, they hacked big corporations, they hacked big government institutions, and they had access to everything. They had admin rights to every machine that had this I guess malicious software installed. That's a crazy threat. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that we had highest levels of like national institutions, international corporations hacked by somebody, we have no idea who. We have no idea who had access to these machines, no idea who was running this campaign. And these are the types of threats that we face. So the fact that our relationship with free speech is changing, the fact that we're like a lot of things are being done that feel very much in violation of the spirit of the First Amendment in particular. And a lot of the decisions are being made behind closed doors. But I think there's also potentially, and I think we're starting to see that, there's potentially unprecedented threats where there may be a good reason why freedom of speech is being eroded. I would much rather have that discussion. But I think I'm willing to entertain the idea that we live in an era of unprecedented threats that require unprecedented surveillance.
Yeah, I mean that's like a whole, again, that's something we could do like a whole show about, is just, safety versus freedom in terms of the amount of surveillance that is required to keep us safe at a time where we are particularly under threat by a variety of different sources of violence and chaos. But I mean, I would argue that the Constitution of the United States is a living document for just such an occasion, that one of its edicts, one of its amendments, would become outdated. And that the First Amendment is outdated not because no free speech for fascists, I'm an anti, not for that reason, which is why a lot of people say that the First Amendment is outdated. I would say that the First Amendment is outdated because the fundamental concept of speech has changed. That in the age of the internet, we need effectively an internet Bill of Rights, because speech really no longer takes place that much in our world. It takes place in a sort of two-dimensional format on the internet. That is where, particularly political speech, which is arguably the most important form of speech, political and philosophical speech, let's say. And that we live in an age where it is impossible, in my opinion, to make the argument that we should not amend the Constitution as a direct result of the communications revolution that is the internet. The internet has not just changed the way we speak to each other, it's changed the way that we live life, period. And we have built some laws around what goes on the internet. For instance, we, as of, I think it was like last year, we passed a law that we can tax goods that are sold over the internet. There used to not be a tax on things you bought on Amazon, and sometime in the last 2 years ago or so, they changed that. If we can change that, why can we not change the Bill of Rights to address the fact that if there are like 2 or 3 companies that decide what you can and cannot say on the internet, then there are 2 or 3 companies that control this country. If Facebook and Twitter can decide what the acceptable boundaries of political debate are, then they own this country. And yes, it disturbs particularly libertarians and conservatives greatly to think of regulating large corporations in this manner. But I believe we have passed the point where there's any argument that these companies have not amassed a truly and obviously dangerous level of influence over our collective psyche. I mean, think about the fact that Google is the company that if you want to know the answer to a question, you don't go to mom and dad anymore if you're a kid, and you're not necessarily going to go to your buddies anymore if you're an adult. You go to Google. Google is your daddy. When you want to know the answer to a question, you go to Google, and Google decides what you see. When you want to interact with your friends, you go to Twitter or Facebook first to get those hits, the dopamine release from the little red one on Facebook or the little blue one on Twitter that says you have a notification and someone is interacting with something you've said. They decide how we feel, what we see, and what we think. And if we are not going to regulate them, given that fact, then we are we are fucking kidding ourselves at this point. I just have very little patience for the kind of like, well, they're up. And again, this is where the fact that I'm not particularly conservative, which surprises people considering what I like to talk about all the time, comes into play. I am not against regulating big corporations. Being a pretty liberal guy, that's never bothered me. And I just have very little patience for the argument at this point, given what we saw in 2020 in particular, with how, by the way, how malicious this is as well. If these were at least well-intentioned companies that simply had a massive amount of power, but maybe they could wield it in a good way, the way that we were kind of arguing some of these individuals like Elon Musk do earlier. But no, these companies are clearly deeply, deeply malicious in the way that they wield their power, and they have an obvious one-sided political agenda. I just think we're so past the point of trying to hold on to this idea that we need to avoid regulating private companies in this manner at all costs. It is just too dangerous to let these companies that have the amount of power I just described, where they are your daddy, they are your friends, they are big brother. I don't think we can continue down this path of just saying we're America and we don't regulate private companies. I think this is going to have to be addressed fast.
I guess I have two questions for you. One, what does that regulation look like? I personally, I haven't seen.
That's a good question.
I haven't seen a great proposal for an internet bill of rights. So that's one issue. And two, is it worse for the government to decide what you can and cannot say on the internet, or for Google and Facebook and other large institutions to decide what you can and cannot say on the internet?
That's too.
I'm not necessarily sure that it's actually worse for Google to make those decisions than it is for the U.S. government to make those decisions. So it's like, I think once that, once that censorship has started, once there is going to be a censor, I'm a little skeptical. I'm more skeptical of a government censor.
Yeah, I think those are two perfectly valid points and questions. On the first point, I would say like that's something that just needs to be addressed by people like me who want to address this. I've said on this show before some of my ideas for an internet bill of rights, to the point where I think on some level you have to basically say that if it's not against the law, you can say it on these platforms, maybe make them a utility. Those are things that have to be worked out. I'm not going to answer that on this show today. It would take me hours. But it would take me days. Like that would be legislation that has to be worked on with a lot of careful attention to detail. I think was the implication of what you're saying, is that this is a big. I am asking a lot of the people who want to solve this problem with me. It's not just a small thing that I can perhaps say as flippantly as I might, that we need an internet bill of rights. It certainly is going to take a lot of effort. The other one is an interesting point in terms of. But what I would say is the government is, I think, more directly answerable to the people in a democratic society than these corporations are. And that the government, by definition, is supposed to check and balance itself and be answerable to the people. And that overall, we've done a pretty good job. As long as the government has been in control of free speech in this country, there's been a good amount of free speech in this country, to the point where we abolished slavery back when that was unpopular. Martin Luther King was able to do what he did. We've done great things by using our First Amendment rights at the mercy of the government in this country. Jack, I know you I think maybe disagree with me a little bit, just kind of knowing your leanings as kind of like a libertarian on the notion of I feel like when I refer to people to whom it would immediately distress them to think of these kind of heavy-handed regulations, you definitely come to mind. I'm kind of curious what you think, or if there's some other aspect of this you want to speak on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can't represent all conservatives, libertarians. I'm more of a libertarian-leaning, or rather, I am fully libertarian. I'm not a conservative-leaning libertarian. But what I would say to your question is to echo what Peter has mentioned, which is, who would be regulating and how would we regulate? Now, of course, you said you're thinking about that, and a lot of people probably have been thinking about that for some time. But you also said you kind of want to get this done. We need to get this done now. We need to kind of rush it in a way. I'm not for, if this is something I were in favor of, I wouldn't want to take years and years and years given the situation. But the reason why, we wouldn't favor something like that is just that it's a principle thing. And I know that frustrates people, because then you say, well, we're in the here and now, times have changed. I just think the original principles in the Constitution, for the most part, it's not a perfect document by any means, but they're there for a reason and they've worked up until now. Um, you know what? I would say they still work. What's not working is the institutions and the individuals in them and the culture of our society. And then you might say, okay, but that's going to take even longer to change. How do you change the culture of society? And I it's a really difficult question, but if you want a long-term solution, I feel like you just need to shift people's attitudes. Um, and then again, I'm just thinking of your arguments coming back to me. Well, who's in control of the narrative and the culture? These major social media institutions, right? This is how people get their information and communicate with each other. Um, my fear also with regulation is the richest companies will be able to buy and own politicians that would be writing the regulations in the first place. So while one institution might have a Bill of Rights that says you cannot violate freedom of speech, you can say what you want. You know, there are very little restrictions minus, you know, child pornography or something of that nature. But then what about the next administration? If it's not something that's amended within the Constitution, it would have to be a law written, which can then be changed in the next administration by executive order. And so that's my argument on that front. And the other thing is, and I've said this in the previous podcast, I don't like accepting the notion that these, like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, they're going to be around forever. And these are the monopolistic institutions we have to accept. And the only way we can live with them is by regulating them. I truly believe we should do everything in our power to allow for as much competition in this space so that we can have alternative means and paths to challenge the restrictive nature of those companies and institutions.
Yeah, but these companies, I really like the idea that they're not just going to be these completely domineering institutions that will never go away and never lose their spot on top. I am really skeptical that in my lifetime, which hopefully is a lot longer. I'm only 25 years old, so there should be plenty of time left in that amount of time. But even in the 50, 60, 70 years I have left of life, I am really skeptical that somebody can dethrone an Amazon or a Google. And it's not because I don't believe in the spirit of competition in this country. It's because these companies are engaging in a variety, a cavalcade, a myriad of anti-competitive practices. And that is just another reason, I think, to break them up or regulate them, because these are things we've done before. I mean, you even mentioned in what you were just saying, Jack, that like we do have limits on these things. So for instance, you can't post child pornography on Facebook. This is something we all agree with. We're all glad you can't post child pornography on Facebook. And that is technically sort of limiting someone's speech. I mean, that is an expression of something if somebody were to post that, God knows what. But there are sort of pragmatic, there are moments where we have to be pragmatic. And I'm going to throw out just an analogy before throwing it back to you guys. I know we've been talking a lot. So I just want to say this. What came to mind as we were discussing this to kind of alert you and others to, and it's something I just thought of, and it's something I think I'm going to be saying from now on, to alert people to just how big I consider the internet as just a thing that needs to be addressed in a big way by our government and by our society. I would take the metaphor or the situation that is often kind of posited, the hypothetical, let's say, that if aliens invaded the Earth, it would be such a cataclysmic, threatening event that the entire world, the world's population, China and the US, all of us would come together to fight the aliens as one. And there's sort of this idea that people always bring up, that it would be this completely world-changing event that would get us to fundamentally change our way of life and give up on principles, the main principle being that we fucking hate each other. Like China and America, all these groups that hate each other would band together to fight this one threat. I actually consider the internet as having been a slow burn version of an alien invasion. It has so fundamentally changed our way of life and the way human beings think, the wiring in our brains, the way our reward structures are formed, the way we interact with each other and think of each other as human beings, that I think it is akin to an alien invasion. And it's just happened very slowly over the course of the past 30 to 40 years. And so we sort of didn't see it as an alien invasion, but I think it requires that level of let's come together to have a big solution, i.e., in the alien invasion scenario, it's forming a world army and a world governing force for the sole purpose of fighting a deadly alien invasion. I would say we need to come together as a global society to say, like, how are we going to keep this thing that is extremely volatile and dangerous called the internet from destroying our society, as it seems to have been, at least to some extent, doing for the past 10 years, as it's kind of evolved to the social media age, Web 2.0 or 3.0, if you will.
Yeah, Scott, I think that's a really good point. I think because it's kind of happened slowly, we've underestimated the impact of the internet just on humanity as a whole. And one idea that I've been thinking about recently is we don't necessarily want to just blindly apply the First Amendment to the internet. First of all, it's an amendment to the Constitution. It actually wasn't in the Constitution to begin with. But also, I think as Americans, we do have a somewhat stubborn relationship to the Constitution. And I'm reminded of I think it's a Japanese poet who said, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought." So, if we're going back to the founding fathers, and what were they trying to create? Beyond, if we're trying to think, what was the Constitution? What was the Bill of Rights trying to accomplish? Let's try to accomplish that again, rather than saying, well, we have these rights and we need to maintain them at all costs against whatever forces are out there. But rather, they wanted to create a new society in the principles of maximizing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How can we achieve that given how the world has changed? And I don't think it's by necessarily just applying the same set of rules and structures that we have had successfully for the last 250 years. So I think we do need to first recognize that this is gigantic. This is super transformational. And we can't just say, well, we're just going to tweak some existing things that were working in order to adapt to this. I think we need to go back and sort of be, James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and kind of try to reiterate or come up with potentially a new set of rules and rights and responsibilities that we can achieve what they were trying to achieve rather than just do what they did.
Yeah, I think last thing I can say on this is I completely understand where you guys are coming from. And we need to adapt. And when you are fighting a war, or assuming there's an alien invasion, or even just a real war in the world, inherently you throw out a lot of those principles, because when you're fighting a war, things are messy. People's lives are going to get lost. People are going to do things that they regret. There's so much bundled into that kind of experience that we all acknowledge that you're going to sacrifice things. But that is in a kind of war state and war mentality. I feel that outside of that, we should try to aspire to the best ideals that we can. I mean, the aim should always be to the ideal, acknowledging that we're going to fall short every now and then. So that's kind of why I still uphold those principles, because the founders did seek something. They weren't saying this is the playbook, follow it to a T, but it was a method to achieving the kind of peace and prosperity that they saw for our country. So I'm open to having those discussions and seeing what that looks like. But I just always like to remind myself and others that, like, if there's an ideal, we should always aspire to it, acknowledging they're going to fall, and just not wholesale throw that out the window, because it has worked for so long. So let's consider the full breadth of solutions. I'll consider your solution, but I also want to help figure out ways of bolstering competition in those spaces, so that we don't have just a few monopolistic institutions that we need to rein in.
Yeah, I think the conversation that we're having just now, kind of before we move on, I just want to say, I think the push and pull that we're having is what a healthy conversation on this topic looks like. I think that it is perfectly reasonable to be as alarmed as I am uh, by what I have referred to as essentially a slow-moving alien invasion that has been the internet for the past 40 years, that has completely enslaved us, much in the way that aliens are depicted to do, and hurt us in many ways, helped us in some ways, but hurt us in a lot of ways. But at the same time, that in pursuit of a solution to this problem, if we the cure can certainly be worse than the disease. I mean, the idea of the government saying, okay, well, the solution to the problem where social media, as you said, kind of said before, Peter, and you've said to some extent, Jack, if the government were to just swoop in and just say, okay, so now, these companies are publicly owned and we're going to decide what you can and can't say on the platforms instead of them, I'd be like, well, that comes with its own slew of problems. Although if you made it as simple as, anything that is not already against the law can be said on these platforms, I think that's a good place to start and kind of have debates from there on what to do thereafter. But yeah, I think this conversation, again, everything we talk about on this show could be talked about for hours on end. But I think what we just discussed is actually kind of a good starting point for this conversation. And it's a conversation I want more people to have. I'm a humongous proponent of something akin to an internet bill of rights. But as you've both pointed out, it's a little bit half-baked. Granted, it's an idea that people have only really been talking about for the past year or so. I know Christopher Rufo basically started talking about this year. We were actually, to our credit, kind of talking about it last year when we were doing the run of Going Dark. But I want to move on to another topic that I think kind of defined 2020, at least in my view. And we're not going to hit on all the topics that I sent you guys before today's show, but that's totally fine. That's normally how it goes. It's better for us to talk in depth about a few topics than to kind of hit all the things I wanted to discuss. But one thing I want to hit on, because it may sound kind of, I don't know, it sounds kind of like it's red meat, it's identity politics, it's what people want to hear about. But I actually think that there is something important to talk about in terms of something that happened in the world of identity politics in 2020, which is that I feel as though feminism had an unprecedented run from like 2014 to 2018. From Gamergate to the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, there was a focus on completely changing the way society views women and the relationships between men and women and gender roles that was focused on biological women. And you might be able to see where I'm going with this. Something has happened in the last like 2 years in particular, which is that it seems that feminism has kind of become shockingly irrelevant. I've never in my adult life, I have never felt more unaffected by feminism as a movement and like it is less relevant than it is today. And I feel as though, unfortunately, as somebody who is not a particularly big fan of feminism in its modern iteration, it's not because feminism has died and gone away or gone back to being, women's rights advocacy, which I certainly support, but it's because other identity-based movements have sort of supplanted it and perverted it into something where it doesn't even resemble what it originally was. Namely, it seems that race has become a much more potent form of identity politics in our society, and a much more influential form than the old sex-based feminism. And also, so what I mean to say by that is basically Black Lives Matter has essentially replaced feminism as sort of the cause célèbre, the favored political cause of the identitarian left, the thing that they're going to use to hammer people over the head. And instead of calling them sexist, they're just going to call them racist. Kind of same shit, different week. But it's a very different week, to say the least. It is a different flavor of identity politics. And also feminism itself has been turned on its head by the trans debate, by the fact that when feminism does crop back into the conversation, and it has a little bit for the past 2 years, immediately whatever conversation is taking place around feminism explodes, because there's a battle between TERFs, or people who are traditional liberal feminists who want it to be a completely sex-based movement, and then the sort of fourth or fifth wave feminists, or whoever you want to call it, that are more like, oh, well, we need to include these biological males who identify as women in the movement, which creates a whole slew of problems for the movement. So what I basically want to ask is, to put it simply, have we essentially seen feminism either killed or at least temporarily sidelined by these two other movements, one that is race-based and very, very influential right now, or at least definitely was over the summer, seems to have tapered off a little, which in Black Lives Matter, and then perhaps even to a larger extent, is it being flipped on its head by what's going on with the trans debate, which is getting very weird. It's becoming impossible to ignore, and I think sometime soon it's going to completely explode. But what is going on with identity politics? Basically, it seems to be a little schizophrenic these days. It's going from group to group and not focusing like it did, in my opinion, so much on one. I think feminism really dominated like 2014 to 2018. What's going on there?
I think the great irony of this is that the intersectional movement has created a hierarchy within the groups that are considered to be oppressed, right? And some legitimately are, but they have created this hierarchy. And Jordan Peterson talks about how those on the left are often seeking to, level the playing field, and they despise those hierarchies that ossify over time and become rigid and don't allow people to enter into the kind of value economy. But in the woke movement, they have created their own hierarchy, the intersectional hierarchy. So those who are the most marginalized are going to be at the top, and their voices are going to be heard the most. And so I think what this has done, and we talked about this, is that this has created kind of this subtle resentment among those at the lower rung, and that includes feminists. And they feel like their voice is not really being heard. Their spaces are being, I guess they would say, invaded by trans activists and others who have their agendas, but they feel drowned out by this. So I think the irony of this is that they have created their own hierarchy that excludes people.
Yeah, Jack, I like that you bring up this intersectional coalition, because I think a lot of it started, I think, piggybacking on feminism, where it was people were talking about fourth wave intersectional feminism, where it's focused on all these other categories of oppression. It's one of these words that, like, it's kind of like people of color. Whenever people say people of color, I kind of like cringe. Like, and I kind of feel the same way about like all the intersectional stuff, where I'm just like, like it actually seems like a pedantic use of the words. Anyway, this was a little side note.
It's true.
But
Yep.
the intersectional movement, I think it started out piggybacking on feminism, and then at some point it just dropped the feminists, like where they realized, like, oh, actually, turns out what Google did that study and found that actually men were slightly underpaid for the same roles. And I think, just a lot of, you look at millennials, millennial women are graduating college and entering employment at rates of 3 to 2 compared to millennial men overall. I think, again, a lot of millennial women, they are earning as much, if not more, than their male counterparts in a lot of fields. So potentially one reason is, it worked, right? And that it turns out women in society pretty much reached parity, and the movement was a quote unquote success. And they're kind of just like, all right, we've won our battles, and time to enjoy the fruits of those victories, and have kind of left that coalition of the oppressed, because, as you mentioned, Jack, there are large segments of the female population, especially in big cities, professional women, who, in the grand scheme of things, really aren't oppressed in any meaningful way. Like, they have nothing to contribute to that intersectional pyramid, and they're like, oh, I get to be, it's like, I can go hang out with the intersectional crowd and I'm treated like shit because everybody's like, you're so privileged, you have all these, it's like, oh, you're just practicing white girl feminism. And like, you can go there and just people are like going to make you feel really bad about yourself, or you can be like, hey, I've got a great job, I've got successful friends, I have all these guys interested in me, like, oh, I can abandon this ideology and sort of enjoy the, whether it's like, like attention from men or whatever, or, just yuppie lifestyle, and kind of do all these things that are now available. Or you can just like live in the, the circles of oppression and think about how to overthrow the patriarchy all the time. Like, that gets exhausting. So I can understand why people might want to check out. So that's potentially the more positive view of that, in that it was kind of a success, and now women have reached parity in a lot of ways, and now get to enjoy that rather than having to be part of these movements. That's the optimistic take. I think there's also a potentially pessimistic take, where maybe women realized what feminism was doing to their lives and potentially making them miserable. I mean, you look at rates of depression among women. I think there's, I'm not going to blame feminism for this, but I think there are I think women potentially in modern times due to social media and career and other pressures are struggling in a lot of ways, mental health in particular. Suicide rates for women it's very tragic, and potentially feminism just offered no answers, where that they have real problems. A lot of women who have real problems and are realizing that feminism, at least in its current iteration, isn't a solution to those problems, and so they're potentially now looking to other places for those solutions. And that's a more negative trend, where potentially they reached economic parity and realized, oh, this wasn't what we were after all. And now you have like MGTOW and all these other these other sort of reactionary movements to the latest incarnation of feminism. And a lot of dudes are just like, I don't want anything to do with women, or potentially like even like in the professional environment after Me Too, it's like, oh, there's a distance, and potentially a lot of women just don't like that. They don't want that, and so they're abandoning feminism because, or at least the latest incarnation of feminism, because the form that it takes either no longer benefits or is actually actively detrimental to their lives. So potentially in either case, it's actually maybe a net positive that feminism has less influence. There's just a positive interpretation in terms of, hey, they made it, or the negative interpretation of, oh, this is totally toxic to their lives and they need to abandon it. Otherwise, it's just a downward spiral from here.
Yeah, I think feminism is. I definitely don't think it's the as much. I sort of. I think that it's really interesting what you said, Peter, about like, is there kind of a were some feminists kind of able to consciously plant a victory flag and say like, we're done, we did it, let's stop complaining. And I don't, that's not how I would describe it, but I think you were actually onto something, and I'm going to see if I can articulate this well. I think on a subconscious level, something like that is happening and has happened, but it's not consciously done. And what I mean by that is, I think that feminists are still outwardly expressing their disdain for white male patriarchy and oppression, and they're still trying to take part in the oppression Olympics and the woke Olympics and be as woke as possible, and they're collapsing under the weight of the dissonance of reality and inside their own heads. Because what's happening is subconsciously they know it is. The race victim narratives that come out these days, I sort of parse through and I try to see what's true and what's false. The gender victim narratives are so ridiculous because, as you kind of alluded to, Peter, you have, and they know this on a subconscious level, they know that you have women who are talking about how oppressed they are while they're, microblogging from their like $75,000 a year job as a fashion writer, and then going to get mojitos after lunch with their tiny dogs. Like these are, and like they've got like 70 unanswered messages on Tinder from guys who would give anything to date them. Like and they know subconsciously, they're like, this is pretty good. Not consciously, they would never say that out loud. And this is the key thing that I think you just left out, is that they would never say that they know they're no longer oppressed. But on a subconscious level, it is impossible for them not to know this, simply because they've got it so good, especially when they think about the historical context. These are educated women who know how women were treated in the past. And if they make that comparison, they go, yeah, things over. This has gone pretty quickly, and I am very lucky to be born at the time that I am. They know this on a subconscious level. It is impossible to deny the fact that gender victim narratives in the year 2020 are by and large utterly ridiculous. And I think that they've just essentially collapsed under the weight of that dissonance because they're kind of running out of things to point to convince people that they're still oppressed. I think that people just, I think by and large, especially, this might seem like a silly point to make, but the rise of OnlyFans, which has shown that essentially, if you are an even remotely attractive woman, the worst you could do in life is to show pictures of your tits and get paid, thousands of dollars a year to do that. That is the floor. Like the floor for male existence is homeless and dying on the street, like that. Whereas for women, if you're young and attractive, the worst case scenario is you're some OnlyFans thought or whatever. And just things like that which have become sort of weird realities of our life, and particularly for people under a certain age, because obviously you don't have 70-year-old women on OnlyFans, at least not them. I don't use OnlyFans. I don't know. Maybe there are some 70-year-old women, but you know what? I'm almost certain that they are, given what I know about the internet. But in any case, my point is, there's a collapse and a dissonance where it's just becoming harder and harder to justify the feminism narrative on its own. It needs a whipped cream and a cherry. It needs a little extra. It needs some extra spice. And if you're going to keep it going, you have to hook it up as this monstrosity. It needs to be like hooked up via a series of tubes to other identity groups as a life support system. And that's basically what we're seeing. And it's becoming a bastardization of it. It's disgusting. It's becoming this Frankenism, like whatever. it's this Franken-feminist monster where like it's connected to the race movements, but then even more grotesquely to the trans movements. And I only say grotesque because the connection between the feminist movement and the trans movement create quite a conundrum for feminists, which is that they are now not only including biological males in their movement, but they are prioritizing and celebrating biological males in their movement. Prioritizing being the key word. And that is where you really get the Frankenstein effect, where it becomes this weird situation where feminists are focusing on natal men and prioritizing their needs because these men identify as women emotionally and psychologically, but not biologically and physically. And that is waking up some feminists, most notably J.K. Rowling, but also a guest I've had on the show, Taya Smith, who is a Marxist feminist. It is waking up some pretty left-wing people like J.K. Rowling and Taya to the fact that this cannot sustain itself. The life support system that feminism has via other identity groups isn't going to work. Like it's already creating friction. For instance, we actually see the gears starting to grind against each other in this weird new machine, this weird life support system. And frankly, just because of how much I truly despise feminism in the age of, I think, a great level of female privilege. I'm all about first and second wave feminism, but I think for really the past 20 years in particular, there's been a great degree of female privilege in this society. And I think I'm kind of excited to see it die, like to see it fail underneath the weight of its own pedantry and pretentiousness and its inability to consciously declare victory and sort of dot its I's and cross its T's and move on.
Yeah, I think maybe because there's so many divisions right now happening between the trans and feminism movements, that internal feminist movements will start to question their own narrative that they've been, messaging for years. Because, once you realize, wait a minute, what we're doing now isn't working. So maybe let's also reflect on the third and fourth wave feminism. Is that really connecting people? Is not to say that they're like a PR firm, but maybe, trying to be fully unified isn't going to work. Maybe we need to actually start asking questions and figuring this thing out and coming up with new ideas. So maybe there's some hope in the sense that because it's currently falling apart, the new version of this will form. Yeah.
I like that. I think one way of phrasing that, Jack, is to say maybe feminists will reflect and ask themselves this question: why can't we just be about women? Why is that? Why is that not enough? Why is feminism not influential if it only focuses on women? And the answer, in my opinion, is because there aren't enough problems for women in modern Western society. But it's not the answer that they want. They want the answer to be, oh, well, we need to focus on Black women, on trans women. But that is creating these problems that I hope make them ask that question that you were kind of alluding to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In terms of what legitimate issues exist, let's say look at music videos and maybe they feel that women are still objectified in a certain sense. And in a lot of videos, sex is the center and the women are objectified in their own way. There's popular videos that are actually, how shall I say, promoted as feminism. I think WAP, right? Ben Shapiro famously did his WAP rendition. If you guys like,
I would argue that's not. I think that's oh man, it would take me a lot. No, long story short, I would say with WAP, I would not say it was a promotion of masculinism. My interpretation would be it is a promotion of a form of feminism that encourages women to act like men. insofar that it encourages women to kind of act as though sex is a low value, low investment proposition. Because I mean, the idea of the WAP video is watch these women act like sluts. There's some, I mean, by the way, I can say that the lyrics to the song are there's some whores in this house. It's not like offensive for me. You can, like, guys, I know people in the comments would be like, oh, you're going to call them sluts. And it's like, the song is called WAP. It is entirely about their vaginas. And the refrain of the song is there's some whores in this house, which is like a celebration. So I'm allowed to say that that's basically the message of the song is watch these whores be whores and celebrate it. That's essentially what the song is saying. And I'm trying to get back to what I was kind of saying with that, which is that I just, my interpretation of that is I wouldn't say it's masculinism. I think it's a weird form of feminism. Like it's another example of how feminism it's become a parody of itself. I mean, to the point where it's feminist to wear assless chaps and sing about how you're a whore. That is self-parody.
Yeah, and you know, libertarians get this bad rap because we're like almost libertine in the sense that we accept, you know, we would legalize prostitution and we would allow for people to express themselves however they want. And you know, honestly, in the past, if I saw that video, I'd be like, oh, whatever, you know, like, and I'm not going to do anything about it. But I don't like the hypocrisy of, you know, we're about these values, but then we're kind of contradicting that in this video. You know, what are the values? And I think it just depends on the times that we live in, you know, because we're in this, we've been in this era of Trump and oppression, that anything goes in terms of what you consider feminist and what shouldn't be questioned. And at the very least, I think feminists will start asking questions more than they have in the past.
Yeah, Scott, I think the trans issue is certainly bringing a lot of these questions to the forefront. I was thinking, like, oh, turns out even in feminism, it's the biological men that are the problem. But the
turns out,
yeah, it's. I mean, I think you're right in terms of they've kind of run out of sort of objective problems to solve. And I think there are real subjective problems, as I mentioned, mental health. And I hope mental health will take a more prominent role in a lot of these movements going forward. In fact, I would likely classify trans as not exclusively a mental health issue, but with an issue that has a very, very high component of mental health involved with it. So I really would love if we were focusing on the mental health issues of trans people. I think that would be a very positive direction that we could go, and we could certainly talk about mental health issues of women. And I think that, you know, women certainly have valid claims to say that, you know, issues with anxiety and depression in the modern world and the way society is structured. And I think framed in that way, we might be able to have a lot more progress for a lot more groups rather than sort of the acrimonious, highly politicized types of organizations that we have now. I mean, I'm just thinking of, you know, maybe the absurdity of where some of these groups go. I forget the name of the actress, but one of the very prominent Me Too charities, you know, they had the scandal recently where I think like 90% of the money that was donated to these groups was used for like spa retreats and like these super luxurious conferences, and very little actually went to helping women.
Just doing favors for the public perception of women everywhere.
Yeah. And it's, you know, I mean, it's sort of like like good for you, but like, you know, you're just pretending that this is actually about something else. You're not actually helping anybody. And I think a lot of these organizations potentially outlive their usefulness. And I think Me Too is potentially a moment that needed to happen, but also needed to end much sooner than it did. And, you know, you just have these organizations and they have fundraising and they have, you know, they employ people, and it's kind of self-perpetuating because there's millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars at stake for some of these large social organizations. So they need to keep the ball rolling. They need to keep the fundraising going. They need to keep the issues at the forefront. And we really don't have a way of pushing back on that. And so I think, you know, something like just the Kavanaugh hearings might be a result of the fact that we had this social movement, and we had all this money behind the social movement, and then we had all of these, you know, luxurious conferences and spa retreats based on this social movement. And so people have a very, you know, in the potentially least charitable interpretation, they have a really selfish reason, because their pampered lifestyles are funded by these social issues. And we don't, as a society, really have a great way of addressing that. And I think that occurs for a lot of issues. I mean, I know, say with the Haiti earthquakes, I mean, that was another giant scandal where a tiny fraction of the nonprofit money went into actually redeveloping Haiti. And just like a lot of people feel skeptical of giving money in the future. So, I think it's the economic incentives end up perverting potentially a lot of these social movements. But given the scandals that we've seen with the do-gooders, the people on the right side of history, hopefully people will be more skeptical in the future of giving money, and of sort of at least recognizing that when a legitimate movement has sort of reached a good point where it should wind down. We don't have a great mechanism for that. I think we don't really understand how those dynamics work. But Me Too seems to be a great example that we can draw from going forward, where there was a moment, it was important. I mean, I'm watching old TV shows and they make fun of Harvey Weinstein. Like, it was it was well known that it's just like, oh, this guy's a creep, a dirtbag, you're gonna have to sleep with him, and everybody just knows it, and we just do nothing about it because he's rich, powerful, and knows rich and powerful people. So I think it needed to happen, particularly with somebody like Harvey Weinstein, but it clearly went too far, and we saw the negative effects on that on a lot of people, very publicly, and probably for a lot of people very, very privately. So hopefully we can learn some valuable lessons from that. Hopefully we can potentially refocus on real issues rather than issues that are manufactured out of economic incentives or greed. I just put it that way. And it's something that happened, I think, so publicly that both the legitimate side of it and the excesses of it both happen so publicly that it'll be a good case study going forward. So I hope the current iteration of the current iteration. I mean, do you think it's like feminism has already taken a backseat, and that it's no longer a fundraising vehicle or no longer an issue, or do you think it's going to come back?
It's going to come back. I was actually going to say, I want to say, and I want to just take a note on the point you made about the fact that I want to make sure I don't ignore this, and we're going to sign off soon, but I just want to say, I love your point, Peter, about the fact that women actually have real issues. Namely, they have incredibly high rates of mental illness, mostly anxiety and depression. What I would say is, I think that ironically, I would say I want those problems to be solved. I don't want women to suffer from anxiety and depression at the rates that they are, whether it's more psychosomatic or it's more chemical or whatever it is. I want them to not suffer in that way. I love and adore many women in this world, despite my disdain for feminism itself, and I don't want them to suffer in that way. But I will say, it seems that those problems are kind of self-perpetuating as it pertains to feminism. Which is that if you're bringing women up in a world where they're told that rape is around every corner and you can't trust men and they're all evil and there's a white male patriarchy that's keeping you down and you have no agency in the world, it's going to give them a lot of mental problems, and they're going to become very anxious and very depressed. I don't know what you expect, but on the notion of what's going on with feminism, to perhaps to close us out, I actually think it's going to come back, and I think it's going to come back the moment that Kamala Harris emerges as probably as president at some point in the near future. It's no guarantee that Joe Biden might pass away just being as old as he is, or that he might resign from office for health problems or for any variety of reasons. But Kamala Harris or another female leftist is going to emerge as president sometime in the near future, sometime in the next 4 to 8 years. And when that happens, I think that might be kind of a renewed interest. Of course, Kamala Harris is a Black woman, so that might kind of have an impact on it, and it might bring up some more of the issues we're bringing up about how intersectionality and feminism collide. But I think that there will be some renewed interest, because you do have catalyzing events like Black Lives Matter didn't reemerge out of nowhere. George Floyd had to happen, and as well as a couple of other events around this summer to sort of make it come back. And I think that the emergence of Kamala Harris as vice president has made people kind of bring up some of the girls get it done, girl power rhetoric some more. And I think that if she were to emerge as president, that we would see a resurgence. I think it's going to come back in some way, but I think it's going to come back with an awkward limp after what's been going on with the trans issue. I think that feminism is in an injured and awkward state where there's an elephant in the room whenever feminism is brought up, and that's that the movement isn't able to focus exclusively on biological women. When I say that, I can't help but laugh because it just is so bizarre. I mean, feminism isn't allowed to be only about females in the year 2020. And that is a humongous elephant in the room that's going to have to be addressed. And it will be, because I do think feminism is going to come back with a vengeance at some point in the next, definitely in the next 10 years. It's going to be back like it was for that kind of 4 to 5 year period where it just was everywhere and unavoidable. But I think I want to sign us off for the day. Thanks to you both for being with me. This was a good chat. I enjoyed this. It's always nice to just have friends on the show. I like all my guests, but it's particularly relaxing and engaging to just be with some guys that I've talked to many times before and will continue to speak to both on and off camera. And I'm sure we'll hang out again soon. For those listening, these are two of my best friends in the world. We hung out on election night and watched everything happen. We were actually going to talk about the 2020 election in this episode, but I've decided not to. That's been addressed on this show, and people kind of know my thoughts on that. And it might have been interesting to go back and forth on it, but there'll be plenty of chances to talk about politics in the future. We'll do this again at some point, when we're available. This has been good. But if you're listening, I want to thank you all for listening. And this is Red Pill Nation with Scott Veritas. You want to hear more of this? Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like the video. If you're listening on YouTube, you can subscribe to the RSS feed on audio platforms. And you can leave a positive review in the iTunes store if you're listening on iTunes. And leave us a comment on YouTube if you're listening on there. Let us know what you think of what we were talking about. I feel it's the kind of thing where people who listen to this kind of stuff would want to jump in. We say a lot of controversial things, bring up a lot of controversial topics. So let us know what you think. And I'll see you guys next time on Red Pill Nation. Thanks for listening.